The sun was setting over the busy airport as Annie checked her phone one last time before boarding her flight. 2 weeks in Europe had felt like an eternity away from home, but the business trip had been worth it. As a senior project manager, she had successfully closed a deal that would change her company's future. Still, her heart ached thinking about her husband, Mike, back home. The past 14 days had been a whirlwind of meetings, presentations, and late-night conference calls. The time difference meant she could only catch quick video calls with Mike during her breakfast, which was his bedtime. She smiled, remembering how he'd always answer her calls with messy hair and sleepy eyes, refusing to miss even a short chance to see her face. Last call for Flight 247 to Los Angeles. The announcement echoed through the terminal, pulling Annie from her thoughts. She grabbed her carry-on and hurried to the gate, excitement building in her chest. The best part: she'd managed to wrap everything up 3 days ahead of schedule. Mike had no idea she was coming home early. During their last call, he'd seemed distracted, almost nervous when she asked about how he was managing at home. Annie knew her husband well enough to guess he'd probably been surviving on pizza and microwave meals. He was brilliant with computers and could fix anything around the house, but the kitchen had always been his nemesis. She still laughed about the time he tried to surprise her with breakfast in bed and somehow managed to set off the smoke alarm while making toast. As she settled into her seat on the plane, Annie scrolled through old messages from her mom. She'd asked her mother to check in on Mike occasionally, knowing how her husband could get lost in his work and forget basic things like grocery shopping. Her mom had sent daily updates, mostly funny observations about Mike's bachelor-style living. Found him eating cereal for dinner again, and the laundry situation is getting creative. The plane took off, and Annie's mind wandered to their cozy suburban house. She bought it with Mike 3 years ago, falling in love with the big kitchen windows that let in the morning sun. Now, after this successful project, they might finally be able to start the renovation they'd been dreaming about. She could already picture Mike's excited face when she told him about the bonus she'd received. But something felt off. The last few times they talked, Mike had been acting strange. He quickly changed the subject whenever she asked about his daily routine, and she'd heard her mum's voice in the background once or twice. When questioned, he brushed it off, saying her mum was just dropping by. Annie knew her mother. There was no such thing as just dropping by in her vocabulary. Every visit was a planned event with a purpose. The flight attendant offered her a drink, and Annie accepted a ginger ale, trying to shake off her worries. She was probably overthinking things. Mike and her mum had always gotten along well, even if they were an odd pair. Her mother, a retired high school teacher with endless energy and strong opinions about everything, contrasted sharply with Mike's quiet, tech-focused nature. Yet somehow, they'd bonded over their shared love of bad science fiction movies and crossword puzzles. Looking out the airplane window at the clouds below, Annie felt a mix of emotions: excitement about surprising Mike, pride in her professional achievement, and a tiny knot of uncertainty about what she might find at home. The last time she'd left for a long trip, she'd returned to find Mike had adopted a stray cat, naming it System Error because it kept crashing into things. What surprise would be waiting for her this time? As the plane began its descent, Annie checked her watch. It would be around 6 p.m. when she got home, prime dinner time. She imagined Mike sitting in front of his computer, probably with a sad microwave dinner, completely unaware that his wife was just minutes away from landing. The thought made her smile, but it also stirred that nagging feeling again. Those hushed phone conversations, the background noises that sounded suspiciously like kitchen activity, her mum's cryptic messages about keeping an eye on things. The pilot announced their final approach, and Annie fastened her seatbelt, her heart racing with anticipation. She hadn't told anyone about coming home early, not Mike, not her mom, not even her best friend. After 2 weeks of non-stop business mode, she was ready to switch off her professional brain and just be home. The house might be a mess, the fridge probably empty except for expired milk and energy drinks, but none of that mattered. She just wanted to hug her husband and sleep in her own bed. The plane touched down smoothly, and Annie was one of the first passengers off. As she waited for her luggage, she ordered a rideshare to her house, splurging on the premium service to get home faster. The driver helped her with her bags, and as they pulled away from the airport, Annie watched the familiar landmarks pass by. The old movie theater where she and Mike had their first date, the coffee shop where he proposed, the park where they walked every Sunday morning when the weather was nice. With each passing mile, her anticipation grew. What exactly would she find when she walked through that front door? Little did she know, the scene waiting for her in the kitchen would change everything, but not in the way she feared. While Annie was conquering business meetings in Europe, life back home had taken an unexpected turn. It all started the day after she left, when her mother showed up at the front door with 2 bags of groceries and a determined look on her face. Rose wasn't the type of mother-in-law who sat quietly on the sidelines. She was more like a force of nature wrapped in a flowery apron. "I promised my daughter I'd check on you," she announced, brushing past Mike, who stood in the doorway, still wearing his work-from-home sweatpants at 2 p.m., and by the looks of it, I came just in time. Her eyes scanned the living room, taking in the pile of takeout containers and the general bachelor pad vibe that had already taken over the house in just 24 hours without Annie. Mike ran his hand through his uncombed hair, feeling like a teenager caught throwing a party while his parents were away. "I was going to clean up," he muttered, quickly gathering the empty pizza box from the coffee table. "I just got caught up in a big project deadline." Rose set the groceries on the kitchen counter and opened the fridge, letting out a small gasp. 3 energy drinks, a half-empty bottle of ketchup, and "Is that leftover Chinese food from last week?" She pulled out the suspicious container, holding it at arm's length. "Oh, sweetie, this won't do at all." Over the next few days, Rose's checking in became more frequent. She'd show up at random times, always with some homemade food or fresh groceries. At first, Mike found it a bit overwhelming. He wasn't used to having someone fuss over him like this. His own parents lived across the country, and he'd grown accustomed to being independent. But there was something comforting about coming up from his home office to find fresh coffee brewing or a plate of sandwiches appearing at his desk. Rhodes had a way of being helpful without being intrusive, and she seemed to understand his need for quiet while working. She'd leave food in the fridge with detailed reheating instructions, stuck to containers with bright sticky notes. A week into Annie's trip, Mike was on a video call with her when Rose arrived. He quickly adjusted his laptop screen to hide the kitchen, where Rose was unpacking what looked like enough groceries to feed a small army. Annie had asked about the background noise, but he blamed it on the TV, feeling oddly guilty about keeping his mother-in-law's increased presence a secret. "You know," Rose said one evening, after Mike had finished another marathon work session, "Annie mentioned you never learned to cook because your mother worked nights when you were growing up." She was putting away leftovers from the dinner she'd brought over. Her famous meatloaf that even Mike, with his basic palate, had to admit was incredible. "Yeah," Mike replied, helping to clear the dishes. "By the time I got to college, I'd mastered the art of microwave cooking and takeout ordering. Annie's the chef in our house." He smiled, thinking about how his wife could turn random ingredients into amazing meals while he could barely make toast without setting off the smoke alarm. Rose was quiet for a moment, arranging containers in the fridge with the precision of a Tetris master. "Well," she said finally, "maybe it's time to change that. Annie's still got another week away, and you can't survive on my leftovers forever." That's how Operation Kitchen Boot Camp began. Rose started coming over every afternoon, armed with recipes and patience. Lots of patience. She started with the basics, teaching Mike how to properly chop vegetables without risking his fingers, explaining the difference between simmering and boiling, and showing him how to measure ingredients without making a complete mess. There were disasters, of course. The great pasta incident of Tuesday night would go down in family history. Who knew spaghetti could boil over so dramatically? And the time Mike confused tablespoons with teaspoons while making cookies resulted in what Rose diplomatically called salt bombs. But with each mistake, he learned something new. Rose turned out to be a surprisingly good teacher. She didn't laugh at his questions, even when he asked if eggs needed to be defrosted. They don't come frozen, as he learned. She had a way of explaining things that made cooking seem less like rocket science and more like a series of simple steps anyone could follow. As the days went by, Mike found himself looking forward to their cooking lessons. It wasn't just about learning to feed himself, it was about connecting with his mother-in-law in a way he never had before. They swapped stories while chopping vegetables, shared jokes over failed recipes, and talked about everything from his work to her teaching days. One evening, as they cleaned up after another cooking session, Rose pulled out an old, worn notebook. "This," she said, handling it like a precious artifact, "is my recipe collection. I started it when I was first married, and I've added to it over the years. Annie learned to cook from this book." She paused, running her hand over the cover. "I think it's time to share some of these with you." Mike looked at the notebook, touched by the gesture. He knew how much these recipes meant to both Rose and Annie. "Are you sure?" he asked, wiping his hands carefully before taking the book. Rose smiled, that warm, knowing smile that reminded him so much of Annie. "Of course, your family. And besides," she added with a wink, "I think it's time someone else learned how to make those cinnamon rolls my daughter loves so much." The cooking lessons became the highlight of Mike's days. Each afternoon, he'd wrap up his work calls early, eagerly waiting for Rose's familiar knock on the door. What started as basic survival skills had turned into something much more meaningful. A daily ritual that filled the house with warmth and laughter. Today, Rose announced one afternoon, setting down her famous floral-patterned grocery bags, "We're going to learn how to make a proper sauce." She pulled out fresh tomatoes, garlic, and herbs, lining them up on the counter like soldiers ready for battle. "No more of that jarred stuff you've been hiding in the cupboard." Mike looked at the ingredients with a mix of excitement and apprehension. "The last time I tried to make sauce, it looked more like brick mortar." He picked up a tomato, turning it in his hand as if it might hold some secret wisdom. "Annie still teases me about it." Rose chuckled, tying on her apron, the one with "Kiss the Cook" embroidered in slightly faded letters. "That's because you try to rush it. Good sauce is like a good marriage. It needs time, attention, and just the right amount of heat." She handed Mike his own apron, a plain blue one she bought him after the great pasta incident had ruined his favorite t-shirt. As they worked side by side, Rose shared stories about teaching Annie to cook when she was young. "She was just like you at first, impatient, always wanting to skip steps. But cooking isn't like your computer work, dear. You can't just Control-Alt-Delete when things go wrong." Mike laughed, carefully mincing garlic the way Rose had taught him, not too fine, not too chunky. "I'm starting to get that. Though I still wish there was an undo button for when I add too much salt." The afternoon sun streamed through the kitchen windows, casting a golden glow over their cooking station. The air filled with the aroma of sautéing garlic and fresh herbs. Rose showed Mike how to crush tomatoes by hand, explaining that a food processor wouldn't give the same rustic texture. "Feel the tomatoes," she instructed. "Cooking is about connecting with your ingredients." As the sauce simmered, they moved on to making meatballs, a recipe that had been in Rose's family for generations. "My grandmother brought this recipe from the old country," she explained, showing Mike how to mix the ingredients with his hands. "She used to say that love was the secret ingredient." "Is that why everything you make tastes so good?" Mike asked, trying to shape his meatballs as uniformly as Rose's perfect spheres. His were more creative in shape. Rose paused, looking at him with unexpected emotion. "You know, when Annie first told me she was marrying a computer programmer who couldn't boil water, I was worried. She adjusted the heat under the sauce, stirring it gently. But watching you these past days, seeing how much effort you're putting into learning, I understand why my daughter loves you so much." Mike felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Thanks, Rose. That means a lot." He looked down at his misshapen meatballs, suddenly determined to make them perfect. "I just want to make Annie proud." "Oh, sweetie," Rose patted his arm, leaving a flowery handprint on his apron. "She already is. But wait until she tastes your cooking. She's going to be amazed at how far you've come." They worked through the afternoon, Rose teaching Mike the little tricks that make a meal special, how to tell when the sauce is ready by the way it coats the spoon, the perfect moment to add fresh basil, why you should never break spaghetti in half, a cooking sin in Rose's book. As they waited for the sauce to reach perfection, Rose pulled out her recipe notebook again. "I think you're ready for something more challenging," she said, flipping through the well-worn pages. "How about we try those cinnamon rolls tomorrow?" "They're Annie's favorite." Mike's eyes widened. "The famous cinnamon rolls? Are you sure I'm ready for that?" These weren't just any cinnamon rolls. They were legendary in the family, a treat Annie had raved about since their first date. "You've earned it," Rose said firmly. Besides, wouldn't it be wonderful to surprise Annie with them when she gets back? Nothing says I love you like mastering someone's favorite recipe. As they finished up for the day, packaging portions of sauce for the freezer, always make extra, it's just as much work, Mike realized something had changed. The kitchen no longer felt like foreign territory. It had become a place of learning, of connection, of creating something meaningful with his own hands. Later that evening, during his daily video call with Annie, Mike struggled to keep his excitement in check. His wife noticed something was different. "You seem happier," she said, peering at him through the screen. "And is that an apron I see in the background?" Mike quickly adjusted the camera. "Just trying to keep my clothes clean," he said vaguely, fighting back a grin. "Hey, how many more days until you're home?" He was already planning how to surprise her with his newfound skills, imagining the look on her face when she realized her takeout-dependent husband had learned to cook. Little did he know, Annie's early return would lead to a surprise of its own, one that would bring their family even closer together. The taxi pulled up to the familiar driveway, and Annie's heart skipped a beat. After 2 weeks away, even the slightly overgrown hedges and Mike's forgotten newspaper on the front step looked beautiful. The driver helped her with her bags, and she tipped him generously, too excited to wait for change. Her hand trembled slightly as she pulled out her house keys. The evening sun cast long shadows across the front yard, and a cool breeze carried the unmistakable scent of, "Was that baking?" Annie paused, key halfway to the lock. In their 5 years of marriage, the only time their kitchen had produced that kind of aroma was when she was cooking. Mike's culinary adventures usually ended with the sharp smell of burning toast or the unofficial scent of microwave dinners. She checked her phone. No messages from Mike or her mom about any surprise welcome home parties. In fact, her last text from Mike, sent just an hour ago, was a sad face emoji complaining about missing her cooking. She smiled, remembering how he'd always exaggerate his helplessness in the kitchen to make her laugh. As she quietly opened the front door, more sounds and smells washed over her. The unmistakable warmth of a preheated oven, the soft whir of their stand mixer, a wedding gift she'd used countless times but Mike had never touched. And voices. Familiar voices coming from the kitchen, accompanied by laughter and what sounded like singing. Annie set her bags down silently in the hallway, slipped off her shoes, and tiptoed toward the kitchen. The hardwood floors creaked slightly under her feet, but the noise from the kitchen covered any sounds of her approach. She could hear her mother's voice now, clear and instructive. "Remember, the dough needs to be elastic but not too sticky." "Like this," Mike's voice replied, followed by what sounded like a bowl clattering on the counter. "Oops, sorry, at least I didn't drop it this time." Her mother's laugh echoed through the house, that warm, genuine laugh that had filled Annie's childhood home. "You're getting better. Yesterday's flour dough incident is officially behind us." Annie crept closer, her heart racing. Flour dough incident? Yesterday? Just how long had this been going on? She reached the kitchen doorway and peered around the corner, holding her breath. The scene before her was something out of an alternate universe. The kitchen, her pristine, organized kitchen, looked like a small flour bomb had exploded in it. White powder dusted every surface, creating a winter wonderland effect on her usually spotless counters. Mixing bowls of various sizes were scattered about, along with measuring cups, spoons, and what appeared to be every baking tool they owned. In the middle of this chaos stood Mike and her mother, both wearing flour-covered aprons. Mike had streaks of white in his hair, making him look oddly distinguished, while her mother's usually perfect hairdo was falling slightly to one side, giving her a charmingly disheveled appearance. But it was their expressions that made Annie's throat tight with emotion. They were both completely absorbed in their task, wearing matching looks of concentration as they bent over what appeared to be dough on the counter. Her mother was demonstrating some kind of rolling technique, her experienced hands moving with practiced grace, while Mike watched with the same intense focus he usually reserved for debugging complex code. "Now," her mother was saying, "the secret to perfect cinnamon rolls is all in how you roll the dough. Too tight and they'll be dense, too loose and they'll fall apart. It's like a gentle hug, firm but loving." Mike nodded seriously, his tongue sticking out slightly as he attempted to copy her technique. "A gentle hug," he repeated, carefully rolling the dough. "Like how Annie hugs me when she's happy but trying not to show it too much." Her mother paused, looking at Mike with surprise and affection. You really notice things like that, don't you? Of course, Mike replied, still focused on his rolling. Annie has different kinds of hugs. There's the I'm so excited I might squeeze you to death hug, the I had a bad day and need comfort hug, and the I love you but I'm trying to act cool hug. This doe definitely needs the last one. Annie felt tears welling up in her eyes. All this time, she'd been worried about leaving Mike alone, about him surviving on junk food and takeout. Instead, he'd been here, learning to bake, bonding with her mother, and apparently becoming an expert on her hugging techniques. She was about to step into the kitchen and reveal herself when her mother spoke again. Annie's going to be so proud of you. All these lessons, all the failed attempts, just to learn how to make her favorite treat. Mike smiled, that sweet, slightly crooked smile that had made Annie fall in love with him years ago. I just want her to know how much I appreciate everything she does for us, and maybe show her that I can take care of her too, even if I'm still learning. Annie's heart felt like it might burst. She wanted to run in and hug them both, to tell them how much this meant to her. But something held her back. The scene was too perfect, too precious to interrupt. For just a moment longer, she wanted to watch them like this, covered in flour and completely unaware of their audience, sharing something special that was about to become one of her favorite memories. Annie couldn't hold back any longer. A small laugh escaped her lips as she watched Mike try to wrangle a particularly stubborn piece of dough, his face scrunched up in concentration. The sound made both Mike and Rose freeze, their hands covered in flour and cinnamon sugar, looking like children caught stealing cookies. Annie. Mike's voice cracked with surprise. He straightened up so quickly he bumped the mixing bowl, sending a cloud of flour into the air. You're early. We weren't. He looked around the disaster zone that was formerly their kitchen, then back at his wife, his expression a mix of joy, panic, and embarrassment. Rose recovered first, wiping her hands on her apron with a knowing smile. Well, looks like our surprise has been surprised. She glanced at the half-rolled dough on the counter. Though I'd say we're caught quite literally mid-roll here. Annie stepped into the kitchen, carefully avoiding a small pile of spilled flour. So this is why you've been so mysterious on our calls. She picked up a discarded recipe card, recognizing her mother's familiar handwriting. And why I kept hearing background noise that sounded suspiciously like kitchen equipment. Mike ran a flour-covered hand through his hair, leaving white streaks that made him look like he'd aged 30 years in certain spots. I wanted to learn to make your favorite cinnamon rolls, he admitted. Your mom's been teaching me to cook. Well, trying to teach me. There have been incidents. Incidents? Annie raised an eyebrow, looking around at the chaos. Every surface seemed to tell a story. There were splash marks on the walls that suggested something had exploded at some point, and was that a dough handprint on the ceiling? Oh, let me tell you about the incidents, Rose chuckled, moving to the coffee maker. Shall we have some coffee while we show your wife our greatest hits and misses? She pulled out Annie's favorite mug, the one with little cats playing with yarn balls. As Rose prepared the coffee, Mike began pointing out various battle scars around the kitchen. See that burn mark on the counter? That was from the great pancake flip of last Thursday. Your mom said I needed to be more confident with my wrist action. Turns out, overconfidence in pancake flipping is a real thing. Annie couldn't help laughing as Mike continued his tour. And that stain on the ceiling? That was when I learned that mixer speeds are not suggestions. Pretty sure we're still finding splattered cookie dough in unexpected places from that one. Don't forget the spaghetti incident, Rose called from the coffee maker. Though in your defense, nobody expects pasta to be quite that rebellious. Annie sat at the kitchen island, taking it all in. The kitchen she'd left spotless 2 weeks ago now looked like a war zone, but it was filled with more love and laughter than she'd ever imagined possible. Her organized spice rack was in complete disarray, with labels facing random directions and some jars sporting what looked like fingerprint art in various ingredients. I had no idea this was happening, she said softly, watching as Mike and her mom moved around each other with practiced ease, clearly having developed their own kitchen choreography over the past 2 weeks. How did this all start? Rose brought over the coffee, setting Annie's mug in front of her. Well, someone, she gave Mike a pointed look, was surviving on energy drinks and cold pizza. As your mother, I couldn't let that stand. And as your husband, she smiled at Mike, He was determined to learn how to make at least one proper meal before you got back. One proper meal turned into daily cooking lessons, Mike added, finally giving up on saving the cinnamon roll dough and coming to sit next to Annie. Your mom's a pretty amazing teacher. Did you know there's actually a reason measuring cups come in different sizes? I just thought it was for variety. Annie reached out and touched Mike's flour-covered cheek, leaving her own fingerprint in the white powder. You did all this for me. Learn to cook, put up with Mom's perfectionism in the kitchen. Hey, Rose protested good-naturedly, bringing over a plate of earlier attempts at baking. My perfectionism has served this family well for 3 generations. Thank you very much. Mike caught Annie's hand, holding it against his cheek despite the flour. I wanted to surprise you, show you that I could be more helpful, more capable in your world. The kitchen was always your space, and I felt like a bull in a china shop whenever I tried to help. Though sometimes more like an eager puppy in a flower shop, Rose added, making them all laugh. Annie looked at the plate of baked goods, some clearly more successful than others. There were cookies that resembled modern art more than actual cookies, muffins that had attempted to escape their tins in creative ways, and what might have been an attempt at croissants, but looked more like abstract sculptures. These are all your practice runs? She asked, picking up what appeared to be a cookie with character. Oh no, these are just from today, Mike said proudly. We had to throw out the really interesting attempts, though I still maintain that my first batch of bread rolls could have been repurposed as paperweights. Annie took a bite of the cookie, and despite its unusual appearance, the taste was surprisingly good. She could detect the vanilla, the right amount of sugar, and was that a hint of cinnamon. She looked at her husband with new eyes. You actually learned proper measurements. Your mother can be very persuasive with a measuring spoon, Mike said solemnly. Did you know that a pinch and dump half the container are not actually interchangeable measurements? That was a shocking discovery. The kitchen filled with the warm, sweet smell of baking as the current batch of cinnamon rolls rose in the oven. Annie sat at the counter, still in her travel clothes, watching Mike and her mother work together to clean up some of the flour chaos. The scene felt surreal, like walking into a dream where everything was familiar but slightly different. So, Annie said, sipping her coffee, tell me about these cooking lessons. I want to hear everything. She couldn't stop smiling at the way Mike kept checking the oven every few minutes, pressing his face against the glass like a kid watching cookies bake. Well, Rose began, wiping down a counter. It started with teaching him how to make a proper breakfast. Remember how you told me he once tried to heat up cereal? Mike groaned, throwing a dish towel at Rose. That was one time. And in my defense, the box didn't specify that it should be eaten cold. The box didn't specify that it shouldn't burst into flames either, dear. Rose shut back with a grin. But look at him now. He can make an omelette that actually looks like an omelette, not a scrambled mess with an identity crisis. Annie watched as her husband and mother playfully bickered about his cooking journey. It was clear they'd developed a special bond over these past 2 weeks. The way they moved around the kitchen together, anticipating each other's needs, finishing each other's sentences, it was like watching a well-rehearsed dance. Your mother's been writing down all my cooking disasters in her recipe book, Mike said, pulling out the familiar notebook. She's added little notes like, remember the great pancake flip of Thursday, and this is what burning sugar smells like. Annie reached for the notebook, her eyes widening as she flipped through the pages. There, among her mother's elegant handwriting, were new notes in Mike's messy scroll. Little observations, adjustments to recipes, and even some surprisingly insightful cooking tips. Wait, she paused at one page. You figured out how to fix Mom's lasagna recipe. The one where the middle never quite cooked right. Rose looked up from her cleaning. Oh yes, that was quite a breakthrough. Your husband approached it like one of his computer problems. Something about heat distribution and layer density. She waved her hand vaguely. He actually made a spreadsheet to track different variables. Mike shrugged, looking slightly embarrassed. I just applied some basic troubleshooting principles. If something goes wrong consistently, you need to analyze the patterns and adjust the parameters. He made charts, Rose stage whispered to Annie, with color coding and everything. But you know what? It worked. Best lasagna I've had in years. The timer on the oven beeped, making them all jump. Mike rushed to grab the oven mitts, the proper ones Rose had bought to replace his old system of using random kitchen towels. The moment of truth had arrived. As he carefully pulled out the tray of cinnamon rolls, the kitchen filled with an even stronger aroma of cinnamon and sugar. They looked perfect. Golden brown, evenly sized, with just the right amount of filling peeking out from the swirls. "I can't believe it," Mike breathed, setting the tray on the cooling rack. "They actually look like real cinnamon rolls." Rose peered at them critically, then broke into a wide smile. "They're better than mine were on my first try. Remember what I told you about the secret ingredient?" "Love," Mike and Annie said simultaneously, then looked at each other and laughed. "Speaking of which," Rose said, untying her apron, "I think this is my cue to head home. These 2 weeks have been wonderful, but I know when it's time to let the newlyweds have their moment." She gathered her things, pausing to give Mike a tight hug. "You did good, son, really good." Annie felt tears welling up in her eyes as she watched her mother hug her husband. The simple word son carried so much meaning, so much acceptance and love. She remembered how worried she'd been when they'd first got married, afraid that her tech-focused husband and her traditional mother would never quite connect. As Rose headed for the door, she turned back with a twinkle in her eye. "Oh, and Mike, don't forget what we talked about. The recipe book is yours now too. Add your own notes, make your own discoveries. That's how family traditions grow." After Rose left, Annie and Mike stood in their flower-covered kitchen, looking at each other. The distance of 2 weeks felt both like nothing and everything had changed. Mike still had flour in his hair, there was cinnamon sugar on his nose, and he'd never looked more handsome to her. Stokey said, gesturing to the cooling cinnamon rolls, "Want to be my taste tester? I should warn you, the first dozen attempts were used as doorstops, but I have a good feeling about these ones." Annie stepped closer, wrapping her arms around his waist, not caring about the flour that would get on her clothes. "You learned to bake my favorite treat, bonded with my mother, and somehow managed to turn our kitchen into both a disaster zone and a place of magic. How did I get so lucky?" Mike kissed the top of her head, leaving a flower print there too. "I'm the lucky one. And hey, now when you're away on business trips, you don't have to worry about me surviving on takeout anymore." He paused. "Though maybe keep worrying a little bit about the kitchen's survival. I still haven't quite mastered the art of mess-free cooking." Later that evening, after they'd cleaned most of the flour from the kitchen and themselves, Annie and Mike sat at their kitchen table sharing the freshly baked cinnamon rolls. The house was quiet now, filled with the kind of peaceful contentment that comes after a day of unexpected joy. "I can't believe how good these are," Annie said, taking another bite. The roll was perfectly soft, with just the right balance of cinnamon and sugar. "You really made these yourself?" Mike grinned, watching her enjoy his creation. "Well, your mom supervised." And by supervised, I mean she stopped me from adding way too much yeast in the dough. Did you know that more yeast doesn't actually make the bread rise faster? Learned that one the hard way. Annie laughed, imagining the scene. "I bet that was an interesting experiment." "Oh, it was explosive," Mike said, wincing at the memory. "We had to scrape dough off the ceiling. But you know what? Every disaster taught me something new." He reached across the table and took her hand, his expression turning serious. "These past 2 weeks, working with your mom in the kitchen, it changed how I see things." Annie squeezed his hand, encouraging him to continue. The kitchen lights cast a warm glow over them, making everything feel cozy and intimate. "Before, I always saw cooking as this mysterious art that some people just naturally understood. Like you and your mom, you both make it look so effortless. But now I realize it's really about caring enough to learn, to mess up, to try again." He got up and walked to the counter, picking up Rose's recipe notebook. "Your mom shared stories while we cooked. About when you were little, about her own kitchen disasters when she was learning. Did you know she once set off the fire alarm trying to make your dad's favorite pot roast?" Annie's eyes widened. "Mom? But she's always so perfect in the kitchen." "That's what I thought too. But she told me about all her early attempts, her failures, the times she wanted to give up. And you know what she said?" Mike sat back down, flipping through the notebook's worn pages. "She said every mistake made her a better cook because she cared more about getting it right than feeling embarrassed about getting it wrong." Annie felt tears welling up again. That sounded exactly like her mother, turning every moment, even failures, into life lessons. So that's why there are all these new notes in her recipe book. Yeah, Mike nodded, pointing to his messy handwriting next to her mother's elegant script. She insisted I write down everything, the mistakes, the successes, the little discoveries. She said a family recipe book is like a diary of love, recording all the times we tried to make something special for the people we care about. He turned to a particular page where a new recipe had been carefully written out. Look at this, she helped me create my own recipe. We called it Mike's Midnight Pancakes because it took us until midnight to get them right. They're not perfect, but they're uniquely mine. Annie leaned over to read the recipe, smiling at the detailed notes. Flip with confidence, but not too much confidence. And watch the edges. Bubbles are your friends. You know what else I learned? Mike continued, closing the book gently. Food isn't just about feeding people. It's about showing them you care. Every time you cook for me, you're saying, I love you without words. And I finally get that now. Annie stood up and walked around the table to Hunkin from behind, resting her chin on his shoulder. And here I was worried about leaving you alone for 2 weeks. Well, technically, you didn't leave me alone. Your mom made sure of that, Mike chuckled. But seriously, these 2 weeks changed everything. Not just learning to cook, but getting to know your mom better, understanding your family's traditions. It made me feel like I'm truly part of something special. You've always been part of something special, Annie said softly. But I love that you and Mom have this connection now. Though I have to ask, what possessed you to try baking cinnamon rolls on your first day back in the kitchen? Mike laughed, pulling her around to sit on his lap. Oh, that wasn't the first day. The first day was learning how to boil water without burning it. Your mom has this whole curriculum mapped out. We started with toast, which, by the way, is way more complicated than I thought, and worked our way up. So what's next on the curriculum? Annie asked, stealing another bite of cinnamon roll. Well, Mike said thoughtfully, your mom mentioned something about Sunday family dinners. She thinks I'm ready to cook for more than just us two, though she did say she'd be there to supervise just in case. Annie felt her heart swell with joy. The idea of regular family dinners, with Mike and her mom cooking together, sharing stories and creating new memories, it was more than she could have hoped for. You know what this means, right? She said, gesturing to the half-eaten cinnamon rolls. No more excuses about not being able to cook. You're officially promoted from kitchen disaster to kitchen apprentice. Mike pulled her closer, kissing her forehead. I wouldn't have it any other way. Though I should warn you, I still can't promise there won't be flour on the ceiling occasionally. Some traditions are worth keeping. They sat there in their kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of love and learning, the recipe book open to new possibilities, and the promise of many more cooking adventures to come. Sometimes the best surprises in life aren't just about what we find when we come home. They're about the new ways we discover to show our love, one recipe at a time.